agencies all trying to figure out primarily where folks were going. Because when evacuations were ordered, it got a little complicated to figure out where people went. They didn't all go exactly to the same place. A lot of them didn't necessarily go to the established shelters, but chose instead to go house themselves with family or with friends in different areas. So it was a little difficult in the first 3 weeks to figure out where resources needed to be directed to and what was the best way to reach people in need. That move definitely needs some work, and we all identified that as something that we can work on during the non-fire season to make sure that those systems are a little more fluid. From a public education standpoint, I will just say that the food banks are supposed to work in concert with the emergency managers within each county. Requests are supposed to be pushed up to the state EOC. Those requests should make their way to the food banks, and the food banks will then respond. So as folks who work in hunger relief, we would definitely count on you all in the future to help direct people to work through that system, which helps to streamline the practice and not create duplication. It's pretty common in the first few weeks of the fire response to have 5 or 6 different people from different entities calling us about getting services to the exact same people with different points of contact for each of them. And that created a lot of untangling work that had to happen early on, which was all very well intentioned and everyone was really mobilized, but it was definitely something that gobbed up the works a little bit. So that's a piece that we'd like to work on in the future, and helping folks understand how the system should operate, hopefully even some of those pieces out. That said, we made some incredible friends during the disaster response. A few of them we're fortunate to have here tonight, and I'll be introducing them in a moment. Overwhelmingly, the Food Depot's disaster response was about getting grocery items to folks who had been evacuated, and then subsequently getting water and non-perishable food supplies into areas that were anticipating flooding after the rains came. So during that immediate mobilization period, we had a very small part of our work, which was in providing prepared meals to a few of the hotels where evacuees were being sheltered. That was primarily around the Cities of Gold and a couple of the other casino hotels that were outside of Santa Fe County. And for several weeks, we provided breakfast, lunch, dinner to a few of those hotels through our Kids Kitchen program, which is a relatively small but important part of what we do. The remainder of our response was all around getting groceries and water and household supplies and cleaning supplies to people wherever they happened to be at. And over the course of several weeks, we started to figure out where they were. It's also true that the fire kept moving, so people kept evacuating. We'd get a good thing going up in Angel Fire, and then the winds would change, the fire would be heading towards Angel Fire, and they'd all leave, and then we'd have to figure out where they all went. So it wasn't without complication, but we had a lot of great friends who were knocking on all the doors and trying to smooth out the road to make things work and for the response to be cohesive. That said, across 4 counties that we serve, the Food Depot distributed just shy of 900,000 pounds of food and water and household supplies over a 6-week period between the beginning of May-ish and the end of June and into July. And what we were able to focus in on once the original evacuations got lifted and people were able to return home was identifying which communities were most in need on an ongoing basis. And of course, that largely centers around the county of Mora and the really profound devastation that has occurred there, which some of my colleagues here will discuss tonight more in depth from their perspective, because they live there and they know. But that is where the majority of our ongoing effort has sort of taken shape. We've continued to receive state EOC level requests for water in areas where water systems have been disrupted or compromised. We've definitely been responding continually to Las Vegas to make sure that we're getting bottled water in to all of the food pantries there. We helped Mora County stage out different distribution centers with non-perishable items and some water as the rains came in and continued throughout the summer as well. We have a once-a-month food distribution that's now happening in Mora And I don't want to say we as in the food depot, but several of the people that are sitting here tonight have a much bigger vision for what this can become. And I want to leave the talking about that to them where it belongs. But the food depot was fortunate enough to partner with some really amazing people who got to work and just got it done in Mora when it was really hard to pull a response together. And we got to do the simple work of just showing up with the trucks of food and making the goods happen. So I would never want to take credit for the hard work that happened on the ground. Our staff has been so blessed to be working with some folks who are so passionate and so capable and really know what the need is there. Our role is to be behind the scenes and just mobilizing the actual goods. We managed to liberate the majority of the donated items from the Salvation Army and get those out and distributed before they got sent home. The Salvation Army, if you're not aware, has great donation recruitment potential. They're visible, people know who they are. So they recruited a lot of donations of food and clothing and pet food and lots of stuff like that, but they didn't have a distribution process in place. They didn't have local volunteers. And thankfully we got connected with them really early in the process. So they were like, please come take away our stuff that they had acquired. And we were happy to help do that, particularly in Mora, with some additional support in Las Vegas. Are there any questions about our particular nuts and bolts before we move on to introducing the wonderful folks who were really running the show on this work? Alrighty then. In that case, I would like.
I had a question for you, Jill. I'm sorry.
Go for it, Jason.
I couldn't get my mute off fast enough. In those instances, you described, the fire changing directions, and then people that you had contacts with suddenly had to remount that whole thing. How did you? How did you then reconnect with folks? If you can go into a little bit more detail on that, and then it sounds almost like you found like kind of a permanent workaround for that, if I heard correctly. So I was just curious about that.
We started to, it was a little tough love, I will say. At a certain point, we finally just started telling people that if they weren't following the process of, getting the emergency manager within the county to make the request at the state level and follow through that process, that we sort of started to enforce that we would only work with a single point of contact. We would explain the process to them, make sure that that got moved through the chain so that we were more able to identify exactly what requests were being made. Now, that isn't to say that the state EOC was perfect either. 2 or 3 people on our staff could get calls from 2 or 3 different people at the state EOC that was all relative to the same request too. But we all practiced really good communication internally. So as soon as we heard from the state EOC, we all texted each other. I've got some great group texts from this experience, but pretty much everybody was on call, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to start responding to those requests for the majority of the 8 weeks that we saw really hands-on activity. In terms of folks who evacuated and then moved and then opened again, what we saw there was that everybody started to just function with cell phone instead of relying on email as a viable source of communication. So we got each other's phone numbers really quick and we just followed each other. So as someone was being evacuated, it was a conversation around, do you need help evacuating your food? Are you going to cancel your next distribution? Are you going to postpone it? Should we relocate it? And where to? So where do we need to get the food to you next? And it was really, without getting like super sappy and emotional about it, it was pretty awesome to see how people showed up. I know the food distribution we had already established in Las Vegas as a drive-through distribution. Almost every single volunteer who was supposed to be running that distribution had been evacuated. They came back into town from wherever they evacuated to make sure that distribution got run anyway. Even though we had the staff to cover it. And during a time when like people had their property to worry about, like their heritage lands, like these huge things, right? That were so personal. Nobody called in on that and just said, no, I got to take care of myself right now. So folks who were in those positions, the volunteers we had doing mobile food pantries and other existing distributions, we all had pretty good connections with each other. And folks that I'd never had the fortune to meet beforehand were suddenly like in my favorites in my phone. And we relied on that as just like moment to moment pivoting to talk about where the food needed to go. And we were pretty in the loop by then about who was getting evacuated next. And our staff paid very close attention to the evacuation maps and the daily briefings on New Mexico fire info and paying attention to where the winds were blowing. So we were trying to stay one step ahead with contacting people that were in communities that looked likely to evacuate and getting a plan in place once we started to be able to get ahead of it. I got a question from Jill Klein in here about whether we worked with New Mexico VOAD, and yes, they were part of the picture. Different in different places and in different ways. Every community kind of had its own heartbeat in this. But yes, we're pretty tied into the New Mexico VOAD network. The Food Depot is actually tied in as one of the ham radio operations centers for profound emergency across the state of New Mexico. So we've been connected to New Mexico VOAD for a long time. So yes, they were part of the conversations. Other questions around just our side of things? Wonderful. Carlos, did you have an order of operations on how you wanted everybody else to speak tonight so I can introduce the right person next?
Yeah, I'd like Representative Montoya to go next.
In that case, Representative Roger Montoya has been generous with his time tonight to come share his perspective on the story of our fire response. And Representative Montoya and I had actually met sometime before this, working on a totally separate project that's also off the ground now, that we were very excited about. But it was fantastic to have a friend in him when it came time to shake the trees and loosen the log jams that came up in those early weeks when things were really confusing and road closures were happening. But wait, maybe we can get a truck through, maybe we can't, I don't know. I can just express our eternal gratitude for his diligence in helping us to find the right people to talk to and do the right thing. To get the truckloads of food into Mora that really needed to happen there. So, Representative.
Pleasure to see you, to hear and remember what we did as a community to respond. I think the operative word is nimble, because we had to be utterly awake and calm and make decisions that could shift in a moment's notice. But the through line was this notion that we had committed partners and we could get something to the people who needed whatever it was they needed, because it literally changed each day and each moment. The volunteers on the ground in Mora were spectacular. There's a gentleman, Mr. Griego's on the call tonight, and I just want to, in advance of his speaking, just give the gratitude, to having those loving people there. I was freaking out, I'm getting emotional, because when your people are hurting and calling you by the hundreds and you're the representative, you have to respond with your heart and your intellect and like action, right? And so having the Food Depot and Jill as a partner, and knowing that our sometimes 3 times a day call was utterly taken and was so responsive. It was just beautiful. And I too feel this sense of gratitude. When tragedy hits a community, humans respond in the most graceful and loving ways. And I was so delighted by that. I had an extraordinary grandmother who lived that every day. And she used to tell us, bring food and be ready to mend a wound or to hold someone, because we just have to be those kinds of people. And I think as a representative, I had to put my sort of more logical, patience and bureaucratic hat way aside and come from the heart. I have legs, I have a truck, I have a voice, and we can do things that are meaningful. The notion when people were moving, we expected the ready, set, go policy to push people to evacuate to the Red Cross centers. Well, they just didn't. I'd say maybe 2 or 3% of the population that evacuated actually used those centers to sleep. They did use them as a point of pickup for food, supplies. That was a very useful construct. But what I was up against was suddenly there were 190 people at Cities of Gold and Okewinga Hotel, 100 people, 99 here and there, altogether about 800 people with very limited credit card capacity, a population that is aging 65 and above, diabetes, cancer, amputations, wheelchairs, desperate people waiting and hoping for some organization in the chaos. And so it was just, I just want to say again, it was people like Roger Ebner from Mayor Keller's office, emergency manager extraordinaire, who just kept us calm and said, we can evacuate these folks. We'll get them into hotels in Albuquerque if we have to. There might be some pointed questions that you all have that I could help pick out. But my heart is welled up mostly with gratitude that no one died in that particular phase of the disaster. We did lose individuals in the flooding portion, which is still ongoing and very real for the people in Mora and Las Vegas, of course, with the watershed issues and the general recovery. But before I stop, I just want to say that the idea of the phoenix rising from the ashes, when we have disaster at this scale, there is an opportunity to rebuild, to modernize, to galvanize, to bring people together for the right reason and make things better, particularly for the next communities that will face this level of tragedy. We must prepare, we must collect and note and shapeshift in terms of what the gaps were. What didn't we do well? What did we do well? And as an entree to my friend and colleague, Mr. Griego, you are a true gentleman and an unbelievable agent, ready at every second to receive every call. Even when the cell towers were down, I managed to reach this man. He gave me comfort. He gave me strength to ricochet that back to Jill and all the myriad of partners to just help our people. So I just want to say thank you for inviting me tonight. It's really important to share, and I'm honored. Thank you.
You choose the next person, Jill.
Well, since Roger went ahead and made an introduction there, that's hard to top. I want to identify 3 different folks or 3 different boxes, probably 4 different people, I'd assume. We have Rachel Martinez here with us tonight, who is the food director at Mora Independent Schools. If I got your title wrong there, Rachel, there's so many words. Rachel was definitely an integral part of the response up in Mora, and the box that says Arthur S. Romero is actually Arthur and Francis, who have long been partners of the Food Depot and were operating a food pantry in Mora County before the fires began. And were really flexible in their thinking. Sometimes we can get really attached to the thing we do and we're not willing to change it or pivot. And they were not stuck that way. So Arthur and Francis definitely have a story to tell about how they embraced a different way of approaching the problem and joined another effort as a collaborative approach, which was fantastic. And Joseph, who, we definitely found each other frequently via text and every other method of communication, but I want to start with maybe all 3 of them. And Joseph, perhaps you could kick us off. I found over the course of the disaster that all roads led to Joseph. If something came out of Mora County and there was a request or a thing happening, eventually that road stopped at Joseph's doorstep. So I always knew that when I was working on something, if it had come from Joseph, it was legit and that we needed to get on it real quick. And I've rarely met someone so deeply passionate and so deeply in tune with the needs of his community and so capable of fierce advocacy. So Thank you, sir, for joining us tonight. If you could tell your story, please.
Okay, I'm trying to figure out my phone. Can you hear me? Thank you, Jill, Representative Montoya. So, I guess for our community of Mora, what we found with this fire, that we basically were not ready for any type of emergency or any type of disaster that would hit this area. We found ourselves in a position that we couldn't get food in. We don't have many stores or grocery stores. So that led to the establishment of the food distribution that we set up at the schools. And I think the biggest part of it was its success was the partnership that came from working with the different organizations and entities, from the food pantry to Representative Montoya and his help in helping us secure food from donations, because what we found with this disaster and this fire and now the flooding is that the federal government and the state are in no position to help or are in no position to offer any help or to assist you in help. We found ourselves in a position that food couldn't come in, roads were closed. We did not have enough food within the area for families to get into their homes or to even be able to go out and purchase. And so through these partnerships with the Presbyterian Church, Art and Francis, and Representative Montoya, the partnership with the school, the partnership with the food depot, churches from around the state, and donations that came around from Texas and Amarillo and California, all through donations. Churches from the Harvest Church in New Mexico to 4-H kids to the Sheriff's Posse out of Santa Fe, the sheriffs and associations out of Taos, and you name it, the emergency response groups out of Española. If it had not been for them, we would not have had the food or the water or the means to provide for our community. And, they just poured in. And as Representative Montoya said, the hard part was trying to get them into a community where the forests and the state had closed the roads, where they weren't allowing people in, but yet they were allowing cattle and horses and dogs to be fed, but not allowing food trucks to come in to provide food for people. And I think that was probably the most disheartening piece that I ran across, that it was just amazing that, we can find the money to feed dogs and cats and horses and pigs and the food for it, but we cannot find the means to provide food for people. And I think that was the biggest piece that was to overcome. But once we were able to figure that out and not depend on the state or the feds, that food flowed in. I mean, we fed for total, I think it was 45 days, and we were turning out an average of 300 to 400 boxes of food a day. We were turning out and water to a community where the power and water had been turned off, and in some cases for up to 21 days. So I think that the big piece here was the partnerships that were created, the organizations that participated, and with no expectations of anything coming back to them, it just came. And I think the biggest piece that was, for me anyways, was, people would come in and ask, do you have potatoes? It was the little things that they were asking for. Coffee, the viejitos asking for coffee. Do you have coffee? We can't get coffee. And we didn't have it. And 2 or 3 days later, it would show up. We'd have coffee, we'd have potatoes, we'd have fresh fruit, things that, that And we didn't have a way to order this stuff to say, okay, I want this, this, and this to be delivered. The big piece was, I think the big supporter in us as we moved into this was the Food Depot and Jill and her crew that really helped us out. The other pieces that came in, like I said, were we had 4 or 5 ranchers out of Texas in their trucks and their gooseneck trailers filled with food that drove hundreds of miles because they heard that we were in need. And then having to get into Mora, finding a back road to get in because they couldn't cross through the county line was disturbing in itself. I think the Food Depot had trucks turn at one time, turn back and said they couldn't come through. And I think that's the other piece, you know, that and what came out of all of this in the end, so I don't hog up all the time, was the issue that we need a food bank, we need a food pantry that is manned and operated, that has food for the North if we ever get into another situation or a true disaster that, you know, you would call a disaster of merit that would impact a county or multiple counties, that we have that place. And through the partnership with Jill and Kendall Chavez from the Food and Hunger Program for the state, we're working on getting that hopefully secured sometime in the future. So I'll leave it to someone else. Jill.
We can definitely dig into that a little bit, but the idea of a collective approach to providing sustainable disaster relief preparedness and having a more consistent availability of food in Mora County is something that definitely needs to happen. And, you know, these are not my original ideas. Most of these I've learned from Joseph, who's been advocating so vehemently during this time. But it is definitely true that the depth of the food insecurity need in Mora County eclipsed that of several of its neighbors by a fair margin before the fires. And with the devastation wrought by the fires and the evacuation and the inability to work, and now the loss of land and property and animals and all the things, that's only deepened, and the recovery is going to be profound and is going to take a lot of time. So there's a lot of different efforts that are taking place on that front. But what is exciting about that is the partnerships that have been developed and the emergence of this idea that we could have a response center right there in Mora that would make us so much better able to respond immediately when something sprang up, and not have this 3-week lag of, is the road open? Is the road closed? Can we get it there? Can we not get it there? It would already be there. And I think what I'm so excited to see is how many amazing forces of nature there are up in Mora who are ready to make this happen. And we're definitely in a position coming out of this with the right connections to state and local government and other entities that are really interested in making sure that something like the log jams that we experienced never happens again. So you can stay tuned to hear more about that. We are going to continue large-scale drive-through distributions in Mora for the remainder of the year that are going to be supplied by the Food Depot, but run by Joseph and Rachel and Joseph's wife Ruth Ann and Francis and Art and the many, many people who make food security work happen in Mora, which is really exciting. So we're not going to stop doing that until we get the more collective vision off the ground. But there's really huge potential there to make Mora more food secure than it's ever been in the past. There's a really cool initiative happening right now called Fill the Freezer. The state of New Mexico helped to pay for replacement freezers for folks who lost theirs as a result of the rolling power outages, whether that is from spoiled meat that made it unusable or power surges that straight up killed the freezers. So there was a huge replacement effort over the last month and a half, give or take, that's happened. And the Food Depot is working with Game and Fish and the state of New Mexico and several other entities to get donations of game or standard farm animal meat over the course of the next couple of weeks. And then we're going to have a large scale meat distribution to residents of Mora with a special emphasis on those who had freezer replacements to help restock those. And that's kind of exciting because as a food bank, we've never been able to tap into game and fish before. And I'll say that also turned over some rocks and created some interesting situations that we had no idea we needed to anticipate. But we're learning, and it's really cool because we've been able to tap into an entirely new network of people who've been very interested in supporting food security work. And all of a sudden my inbox got flooded with stuff like, oh, are you getting any of the pikes from the pike tournament this weekend in Eagle's Nest? And I'm like, what's that? Who's running it? How? Where? How can I get that meat frozen? Like, what are you doing with it? So we're going to do this again in the future. And I've learned a lot this time around, but it was definitely a little more than I expected. So Rachel, Art, Francis, do you have things to share about your perspective during this experience?
Couldn't feed students, but anyways, we did have some food items that we were able to save that I was able to donate to the food distribution center that Joseph had already started. And so we did utilize some of that. We also did lose food items that were in our freezers due to the power outage, but we were able to save a lot because in Mora, the power outage had only been out for 3 days. And at our school, we keep our walk-in freezers at like 10 below zero. So the food in the freezer was good. We do have another site in Holman. And at that site, we did have three reach-in freezers that we lost quite a bit of food to. So, but other than that, I pretty much stuck around. We helped just with the food distribution. I mean, like Joseph said, there were hundreds of people that were still here and more that had not evacuated and that didn't have, they were running low on food. So that was thanks to Joseph for starting the food distribution at the Head Start. Another person to thank is Ruth Ann she's the president of the Mora Creative Council, and she was able to reach out and get a tremendous amount of funds and donations as well. And those were also brought to the Head Start. And then I also stayed and helped my son Kendrick. He owns Hot Joe's restaurant in Mora, and Mr. Montoya helped us deliver meals. We prepared the meals, breakfast and dinners, and then they went out and distributed them to families that were homebound because they couldn't even leave their area, because if they did, they would not be able to get back home. And so there was just a lot of people that stayed to help that we need to be grateful for, and which we appreciated all the assistance.
To give an idea on numbers, and this is beyond the distributions that Mr. Griego described. So the work that Main Street Mora was doing in terms of distributing those boxes, those hundreds of boxes on a daily basis, once the food depot came in and helped with the drive-through distributions on a large scale, the very first distribution that we did up there, we saw 266 households come through that distribution for just under 1,000 people receiving assistance. The next time was even more households at 328. And the most recent distribution up there, I think, was up around 400 something again, wasn't it, Rachel?
It was, I think it was
440.
440. But before that, I think the second to the last
July one was,
the July was really high. And
Yeah.
that one was, I have my, hold on.
it's 565 households. That was well over 1,000 individuals that were served there in July.
So the total households in July was 987 households. Household,
great.
well, that was household members. So the families, it was 564 households. Yes.
So
And that's what
huge
we've done
distributions for the drive-through distributions in terms of attendance. And to put that in context, that rivals some drive-through distributions that we have in Santa Fe. You know, just to put the need in context there. So certainly I can't, as a food banker, I don't think I can stress enough that the task of preparing 200, 300, 400 boxes for distribution on a daily basis is massive. That's the kind of thing that we accomplish with dozens and dozens of volunteers and a staff that's really highly trained to do that kind of thing. So there is absolutely recognition required for the feat that you all pulled off when you were just figuring it out from all the different sources. It's amazing what you've done.
Yeah, we've had a lot of people that have assisted and helped. And that is, I mean, it's tremendous. It's heartwarming that we as a community have even had to come together and help each other in ways that like we never thought of before. So it is awesome to have people in this community that are willing to help out.
And speaking of that, we've got Art and Francis here tonight, who have been running the food distribution out of the First Presbyterian Church for a number of years. We definitely crashed their party in Mora and brought out the big guns that were present there. Art, would you like to share your story?
I will. First of all, thanks to everyone that has presented. I want to say that the need here in Mora was really great. Our Mora Presbyterian Church started about 8 years ago, and we do a monthly distribution. It was the fourth Wednesday. Of course, we missed in May because we evacuated, and our help is pretty much seniors, a lot of our elderly people. But then we found out that they were doing one with Joseph. Joseph and I were co-workers years ago at the school. So we just hooked up and realized they were doing it, and found out from the food depot that was happening. And we thought, wow, you said it right. Ours is so small and your pop-up was so great that we thought, and they were so close together. The big reason was yours this month, we would have had it like 4 days after the pop-up. And it just made good sense for us not to have it. And Francis and I and Carlota Gutierrez, that are regulars at the Presbyterian Church, went and helped over there. A lot of the same people that we serve were attending there, and that's great to see them. And we met other people. But, you know, several things have happened, that not only the food distribution, but now the flooding. And of course, people need that additional help at this point. I'm the president of the Water Association in Holman. We had a pop line, and again, there's things that you're not prepared for, and we had to do a lot of things. But I think Senator Montoya said it well. It's best to sit back now and say, what could we have done better, and what do we need to plan for in the future? I don't want to say too much more. I want to just thank Jill and all your staff. You have a tremendous staff, able to joke with them. And, you know, we have met Sammy, of course, because he was our driver. But all of your staff is really responsive to, and everybody wants to be the boss. They move the car, move the other one. But it's
There's
great.
been a lot
It's
of
just-
bossing going on. From
Oh,
all of
it's
us.
just great camaraderie, and it gets to be just a joke at some point. So thanks for all you're doing, and I'm glad you're continuing this pop-up, and we'll be willing to serve and help. And I think we'll take a look at what we're going to do come January, and we'll be visiting with you to do that. I don't want to say much more, take much time, but just to share that we're a part of a good community. In Mora, we're a political community, but when it came to this, people came together and realized that we're here to help our neighbors, and that was great to see. Thank you.
I will share, like, from an outside of the stats and the spreadsheet and all of the things, it was probably one of the most profound and emotional experiences of my life to sit in the middle of this. And I've been in hunger relief for 10 years. There's some competition. Certainly COVID put up some memories on our front, but I think the days that we spent when those roads were closed, trying to figure out how to get food up to the people who stayed behind, and hearing no, and trying to find a way to yes, and the constant text messages from Ruth Ann Griego, who was like, but we really, really need it. And talking to Representative Montoya, like, is there anyone else you can hit with a sledgehammer to make this happen? And then him coming back to me with a thing and me being like, but really? And trying to tell Ruth Ann, I think it was 5 days from start to finish when we first started going back and forth, trying to find out which road we were allowed to take the food in on, under what conditions, with what escort, and who the contact person was to get actual permission. And when it finally came through and I heard that that truck made it to the drop point and unloaded, it was over 100,000 pounds of food. I cried and cried and cried that it had finally happened. And it went over the course of a weekend. I think we started fighting about it on a Thursday afternoon, and it was like Monday that it got dropped off. And it felt like I was sitting in the middle of this experience, that there were these, you know, this group of people that were all working so furiously to make sure that hundreds of families had access to food in the middle of a fire that had wiped out their entire heritage. And it was just the most unbelievable thing. And I felt this profound pressure to do everything I could to pull every string and call every person. And I know that everyone at the food depot felt the same way. And it will always stick with me. The intensity of that moment and the profound relief when it came together. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't share the emotional experience of sitting inside that also.
I completely agree, Jill. It was a transformative time. I will never forget what happened, you know, the emotional content. We had to bend the rules, you know, in order to get something to happen. We had to break the law. I mean, That was the rubber hit the road. And there were many instances where Homeland Security came very hard on me and said, you need to stop what you're doing. You need to stand down. You are breaking the law and you are putting people in danger. And I had this moment of like, this is a moral obligation. This is not about a policy or a bureaucratic thing. We need to act, and we must find a way to be safe and legal and work with the federal, state, and local, and honor the people who decided on their own that they could not evacuate and would not evacuate by the hundreds. And when that juxtaposition, that reality check on, yes, we want them to evacuate, but they are not evacuating, and that poses a humanitarian disaster, action had to be taken into our hands. And that's what you're describing. We were at this emotional throttle, just like desperation, but also inspiration, that we will make it happen, and we will unload the truck if we have to on a road somewhere and get it into smaller vehicles and sneak it behind the lines and get it in, damn it, because we will and we must. And I think that was what I'm proud of in the end, because we kept our people as safe and as fed and as comforted as we could, period. I do it the same. I think it had a part to do with why I was not reelected, just saying out loud. I was not a favorite of this administration after this fire, but I would not change one thing I did because it was the right action and it was about community. And Jill, thank you so much for stating that just a few moments ago. I had to chime in. The takeaway as well, beyond just the food, when we talk about emergency preparation and what we're going to take away for the next communities, I've proposed in my rural task force that we look at a regional depository of things like emergency water purification and generators. And what happens when the cell tower melts? Why can't we have a Starlink above every rural community in New Mexico in the event that we must communicate? These are things that a state like New Mexico, with a tiny population we have, and this excess of oil and gas revenue, that we should be deploying and putting in place to protect particularly the rural areas. My heart aches and my heart is singing because the rural areas are what make New Mexico so special. The people in Mora, San Miguel County, and every other disaster area, the very best emerges. And we see what makes humans so special when they act to protect and help one another. So those are some policy recommendations that I hope will be lasting and have absolute implications on the national level. President Biden needs to hear directly from the people in Mora what really happened, what's continuing to happen, and what the takeaways are for the next communities in line for climate disaster.
I want to thank Representative Montoya for his comments. I do think that it's all part of the efforts to address hunger in New Mexico in a very holistic and broad manner. The Interfaith Hunger Coalition has been working for a while with Representative Joanne Ferrari, who chairs the Legislative Hunger Caucus. And so we're trying to get these types of things for the caucus to consider. So I do appreciate the clarity in which you especially the work of the Rural Task Force. So thank you for that. I do have a question. There was the obvious thing, of course, that the Mora was the community, the Mora County, that was most impacted by fires. But what was the impact of the fires on other nearby communities? I'm seeing a Jill Klein from Las Vegas and seeing what and Jill Dixon can probably tell us also what was the impact in some of these other communities.
Well, I can say that obviously Las Vegas saw and continues to see profound impact. I think, if you haven't heard about what's happening with the water shed in Las Vegas, it's perilous and deeply complex to fix. It's a large scale issue, and that holds true in 1,000 different variations for a bunch of different communities in that area. We saw a very profound need in Las Vegas over the course of the fires and then the immediate recovery afterwards. We saw very profound increased distribution at our drive-through distributions there. We definitely provided substantial support to the Red Cross and the shelters that were set up in Las Vegas. We heard a lot of stories there. It's interesting, as Mr. Montoya said, that a lot of people didn't go to the Red Cross. One of the services they were offering was, mental health care and therapy and that kind of thing. And we wished maybe that more people had been there to hit that up, because what we saw is we had people coming through our drive-through distributions in Las Vegas was our staff who were just doing simple registration. How many households are you picking up for? How many people are in each of those households? Just basic data collection. We're being invited to sharing the story of what people had lost, where they were evacuating from, what they had lost, how long their family had been there, what it was like to be not able to go home, how frustrated they were, how scared they were, how sad they were. And we were all there underneath a really pretty smoke-choked sky during that time, watching the fire retardant just land on the mountains behind us. And it was pretty intense. So, definitely we saw people in Las Vegas for profound periods of time, and we heard a lot of stories there. There was definitely a core group that was doing great work in Angel Fire to handle evacuees, and then that pushed up into Taos in substantial ways. And there were great partners who held the line for a long time before it was time to pack up the dog and go. in Eagle's Nest, in Angel Fire. There was a lot of really fantastic work being done in there too. And certainly we saw people spill out, like Representative Montoya said, into Espanola and into Rio Arriba County. People took any road out and went that way if they had people in those areas. So we saw the spillover into a lot of places, and then that started to recede and be more specific to Las Vegas. And then eventually when people started to be able to go home, that's where we've centered on Mora as one of the focal points of our effort.
Thanks, Jill. I don't want to put Kurt on the spot, but no, Kurt works with an advocacy organization in Santa Fe. Do you have any questions, Kurt?
Thanks for putting me on the spot, Carlos. But actually, one that's been mulling over my head, I've been, some of us and the Lutheran Church and the Conference of Churches and Jill Klein with the Episcopalians have been meeting some about how we can support the rebuilding efforts, the ongoing efforts that are occurring. And so it's been very helpful to listen to all of this information. And so I think, Jill, you can chime in, but I think we would really like to hear what support is needed now. Is it primarily dollars? And how can the faith community support the ongoing efforts up there?
We have a saying at the Food Depot that you can donate, advocate, or volunteer. And so I would say all of the above. I would, and if I can just be as frank to say, it is not super helpful to donate food. It's way more helpful to please donate money. We know, Mora knows what they actually need, and being able to have the financial resources to buy those things is so much more valuable. And the truth is, although we're loving all of the in-kind donations, especially from the hunters of the game meat, we could stretch your money farther to buy the meat too, than you can, unless it is something that you hunted. We could definitely use you all as a faith community and a collective voice of power on the advocacy side with some of the issues that Representative Montoya mentioned, in terms of pushing forward relief agendas, advancing real world disaster relief policies and practices, speaking out in favor of something like the Mora Food Collective Disaster Response Center ending up in Mora, helping to fund that once it actually gets moving. All of those are things that are really going to need support moving forward. But I think advocating at every level for improved disaster response practices and policies and preparedness, every single time that comes up, it would be great to have as many voices as possible in the middle of that conversation.
Yeah, that was my second question, was for Representative Montoya. And that is, I know we're dealing with multiple layers of bureaucracy here, but I would be interested in hearing more about what you would recommend in changing state public policy at the state level primarily, since that's where we work. And maybe it could be an offline conversation, but I would agree that things need to change.
If I can offer just a little bit of my thoughts, I notion that sort of a repository regionally where those emergency tools and equipment could be stored. Case in point, we needed generators, and the state, the Homeland Security levels of bureaucracy were major barriers to getting. It was going to be weeks. You have to send a letter over here and it has to be stamped by this person, and then it'd be sent back. I was like, we don't have time. We need to know that we can get those materials. So a remedy is to think maybe 7 or 8 regions throughout the state where emergency supplies are stationed, and that within a number of hours, not days or weeks, we can get those supplies where they're needed, particularly in rural areas. That's one public policy I think that's really, really important to consider, particularly, as I said, because of the surplus that we have right now. We should invest and keep that absolutely at the highest capability technologically as we can. We may never see in our lifetimes, I'm just going to say this, broadband across rural areas. I'm just running out of patience. I don't see enough action. I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but I really believe that in certain areas where topography and jurisdiction are barriers, Starlink might be a much better way for us to look at how we remedy that, particularly in emergency settings. I don't want to go on too long, but I wonder if I could take a chance to mention a few names of folks in Mora who were not included. Commissioner Veronica Serna is still working her tail off. Toby Lovato and Greg Elbring, two volunteers extraordinaire. Christy Wolf, Sheriff Amric Padilla, what an incredible young champion he is. Teresa's tamales, not only for her delicious food, but her heart. And the list goes on, because when we talk about community coalition building and grassroots efforts, it takes a community. It sounds trite. And when emergencies hit, it's how we're at our best. So I just want to call out those names. I hope I answered your question, sir, Mr. Kurt.
Thank you. We have two hands up. Let's go to Jill Klein first, and then to Kathy Fries. We can't hear you, Jill.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I think my little microphone wasn't plugged in. So I know a couple of faces here. I'm new to Las Vegas and Raton in terms of the work that I do, but I've been in Taos and doing food pantry work up there, and coordinated the food at the evacuation center in Taos for 6 weeks, 7 if you count the resource center. And I want to respond to a couple of the things that I've heard asked relative to what I saw in Taos and some of what I'm still seeing in Mora and San Miguel. We had in Taos during that 6 weeks, somewhere between 250 and 300 unique families come through for resources. And we had anywhere from 7 to 15 people per night staying actually in the shelter. So that need for resource was really, really high. And I knew it was similar with other shelters versus resources statewide. And it did make it impossible to know how much food was needed and where. And the Food Depot brought a pop-up for us in Taos during the evacuation process. And we were, even with the pop-up, we were still doing our regular 450 to 500 families a week out of our food pantry, plus what the shared table does every other week. We do ours weekly at St. James. I met a lot of people in Taos at the evacuation center who were from Guadalupe and Holman and Mora, and not so much from the Las Vegas area because those folks had gone south. And what I'm seeing right now, what I'm still hearing is not necessarily I'm actually hearing a lot of people who they still haven't gotten a freezer replaced. They still haven't gotten their meats replaced. And those folks who hunt and provide for themselves off the land, that's to lose everything you've got in a freezer is worse than for those of us who just go to Super Save or Walmart. And whatever we need to do to try and help with that. I mean, Jill, if there's money that needs to go towards supporting that, let me know. I think you have my email from the St. James days. But the other thing that I'm seeing right now, and I'm a little out of the loop because I had COVID and kept me out for 2 weeks, but the long-term recovery group at Neighbors Helping Neighbors is really in Las Vegas, is really doing some phenomenal work and helping to see things coalesce. And what I want to do in my role in Las Vegas is learn how we can fit in and help, not how we can reinvent any wheels. You guys did amazing work in boots on the ground with the people who were staying there. And at Roger, Representative Montoya, God bless you, I met you in Taos, and I think you're exactly right about why you didn't get reelected. And it's unfortunate because I think you saved people's lives by making sure they got food. There was something else I wanted to say and ask in there, and it's completely escaped me. I'll put it in the chat if it comes back to me. I still have COVID brain. And I can't wait to be a part of more of the solution as we move forward. That generator, having those silos throughout the state where it's volunteer organizations who have control over it, not the bureaucracy, is desperately needed. because we were all caught off guard. And I think we're going to be caught off guard this winter too, because we're still having transportation issues from floods. I'm surprised it's only 440 families on a monthly basis coming to get food, but that's virtually all of the families, in terms of the population that's there. So we've got maybe 6 more weeks before we start having some deep freezes and weather starting to bring some really significant issues. I think that's something that we're going to need to really be ready and prepared for. So thank you guys for all your work and for the invitation to come tonight.
Thank you, Jill. Kathy.
Thanks, Jill, and I hope you feel better soon. It's really hard to live in Albuquerque and really try to want to help people up north. And I think that was a great challenge for many of the churches in Albuquerque, and it was for Catholic Charities. But I want to say that the VOAD group that meets on Wednesday nights via Zoom is a great resource to go to learn what the needs are. And so I recommend, and if you need information on that VOAD group, you can contact me. And also the long-term recovery groups report every week of the current needs and stuff. And so if you're looking for ways to help, I think that's a good way to stay connected on current needs at that time. So I recommend both those things. That's all. Thank you.
I think we probably want to start wrapping up, but if we have any last minute questions, but before we do any last minute questions, I'll express our deep appreciation on behalf of all the members of the Interfaith Hunger Coalition to Jill for she organized most of it, and then and for the presenters who offered all their wisdom, the information that many of us who live in Albuquerque don't really have access to what really happened. And so it's important for us to know and it helps us to be your allies whenever we can. So I do certainly appreciate that. But any last minute questions?
I don't have a question, but I have a statement. If I could just add on a little bit, it's related to comfort. There's going to be a tremendous need for keeping people warm in Mora, particularly our elders. And there's a wonderful action in play right now that Toby Lovato, the gentleman that I mentioned earlier, has organized. The U.S. Forest Service is bringing in untold amounts of cut green trees that were clear cut, in various areas. And Toby has fundraised, and we are continuing to fundraise. There's a chopper and a splitter of wood. 250 cords are going to be delivered to seniors first, and another 250 cords. So could be an ongoing micro business. It's kind of a startup, a grassroots startup. We've raised over $20,000 already from foundations. But if anybody's interested in supporting that effort, it is heartwarming. It is so beautiful to see it happening in real time, because high school kids are driving the trucks of wood to the seniors. I mean, it's amazing. I'm excited for that.
Thank you. I wanted to mention a couple other things. So for those of you who are affiliated with faith communities, the Interfaith Hunger Coalition is always looking for folks to endorse us. A lot of our faith communities are in Albuquerque and some in Santa Fe. We have a couple in Taos, but we do want to be able to reach out beyond our little area to connect with other faith communities, to be part of the big voice that seeks to address hunger in New Mexico. So just look for the Interfaith Hunger Coalition's website, and we have a form. It doesn't imply any monetary commitment, just a commitment to be part of the voices to address hunger in New Mexico. The Methodist Church that operates Share Table is one of our endorsing partners, Sherry Lyon, and then so is St. James. So we appreciate the connection with Taos, but most everyone else is in Albuquerque, Santa Fe. Also, I wanted to mention that we thought about looking at the fire situation holistically, and this at last minute decided not to include Ruidoso, but they have experienced some fire damage early on. I'm thinking of Ruidoso because I see Ellen Young here from Las Cruces, so we appreciate Ellen Young from Peace Lutheran Church in Las Cruces, kind of tuning in. So any last minute comments or questions before we close?
I'd like to make a comment if I could.
Yes, please, Joseph.
I'm sorry I had to jump off. I had another call, but I'm back. I wanted to just, relay out to, we have a lot of partners, and I think a lot of those partners have really helped our community. I think the biggest piece in those partners has been their, how do I say it? Being so giving without expecting anything in return, from companies to foundations to, we've been working with the Mora Creative Council, the Santa Fe Community Foundation, the Antonia Roybal Mac law firm, and they've been providing, vouchers for propane. We've got the Methodist Church out of Santa Fe that has bought wood for seniors in Mora that have been working hard to help us with this relief effort and the flooding, and the long-term recovery group, which is now established here in Mora, which is being chaired by Dr. Martinez at Luna Community College and Jennifer Cabral out of Las Vegas. And they're doing a lot of groundwork here, trying to ensure that we move forward. I think the big piece that we're going to need as we move forward is the support for this food distribution, food pantry in Mora. We've got great partners, the Presbyterian Church, Mr. and Mrs. Art Romero, the Mora schools. The county has now agreed to support us as well. So we've got the support, and now we've got to take that support and that partnerships and hopefully get the governor and the state legislature to see the importance of a food distribution, food center. And Jill and her crew have worked tirelessly to help us out in regards to how they work, how they operate, what's needed, from designs to everything else. And now we're in a position that we now need if you would, the push from the constituents and around the state to say this is a need and how do we get it done.
Thank you for that. And any last comments, Jill, before we close? Jill Dixon.
Thank you to Jill Klein also for your tremendous work up there. It really did reach out everywhere, and you guys did a great job. But thank you most of all for you guys being curious and wanting to find out what really happened on the ground. I think it's always so important to ask the people who lived it what their experience was. So thank you for exhibiting that practice here tonight and for taking the time to hear our story. And we certainly welcome you as advocates and partners in this, and we want to work with you in the future.
And on that note, I'd like to say that it's not just faith communities that are endorsers of the Interfaith Hunger Coalition. We have a lot of agencies, including the Food Depot and Roadrunner Food Bank. So, and a lot of others. And so, Lutheran Advocacy Ministry. So I want to thank all of you for being here. I have all your emails, and once we have a shareable link on YouTube, we'll be sending out the video. Thank you so much.
Thank you.